What if I told you that medieval people didn't use toilet paper at all, and that what they used instead will shock you to your core? Before we uncover this forbidden truth, hit subscribe right now, because the stories you're about to hear are the kind they buried in secret archives. Drop a comment with what you think they used, and like this video to make sure the truth doesn't get buried again. Now, let's step back into a world that smelled of fire, mud, and disease. A world where sanitation wasn't a convenience, but a battlefield between class, poverty, and power. Imagine it is the year 1348. You're in a medieval village. Streets are narrow and suffocating. Pigs and dogs wander freely. Children play among piles of refuse. Chamber pots are emptied straight into the gutters. You pull your cloak close against the cold air, heavy with smoke and rotting waste. When nature calls, you duck behind a leaning wooden shack. There is no roll of paper, no cotton, nothing soft or clean waiting. Instead, you reach for what every man, woman, child reached for in those century straw, sharp husks, brittle leaves, moss damp from a stream. If you were lucky, perhaps a rag. If not, maybe even a seashell. This was daily life in the Middle Ages, but hidden inside these details is a truth far darker than trivia. This story isn't just about filth, it's about survival, class, and control. The first clue comes from an overlooked 14th century household manual known as the Book of Secrets. At first glance, it offers herbal remedies and cooking instructions, but in its margins, scribes added cryptic notes about daily habits, scraps of wool used in noble houses, hay and moss in peasant huts, pages torn from old texts when nothing else was at hand. Think about that for a moment. Pages torn from old texts. Imagine a fragment of a manuscript or piece of parchment from a discarded sermon, reduced to the final use of wiping away waste. This was not mere poverty. It was heresy. And yet, it happened often enough that the church issued warnings about the misuse of sacred parchment. But archaeology reveals an even stranger truth. In the 1970s, excavations in medieval London uncovered cesspits filled not only with bones, pottery, and waste, but with cloth rags bundled together, still stained centuries later. In some pits, fragments of seashells were found. Their edges are sharp, but worn with use. One historian published these shocking findings only to see his extended work vanish. He claimed institutions pressured him to stop. Why would medieval toilet habits need censorship, lest they revealed something much bigger? The truth is that hygiene in the Middle Ages was never equal. What you used after relieving yourself marked your class. Peasants scraped with straw, leaves, corn husks, or moss. Nobles used cloth, soft wool, or even imported linen. The wealthy even had servants tasked with preparing basins and clothes for their privy time. In royal courts, toilet cloths might be washed in scented water and reused. While peasants suffered bleeding and infection from rough materials, nobles wiped in comfort. Sanitation was class warfare, written in straw and linen. But here lies the forbidden detail. In monasteries, the practice was often communal. Monks shared rags, sponges, or scraps washed and reused again and again. One 15th century Italian physician warned in his notes that this practice spread sickness through abbeys. He begged that communal clothes be banned. Weeks later, he died, his work suppressed, his name forgotten. Suppressed knowledge is itself a sign of conspiracy. If hygiene was so dangerous to speak of, why erase the record unless silence protected someone? And then we find the strangest whisper of all. Some records suggest that old manuscripts, sometimes destroyed by church decree, found their way into privies and cesspits. Scholars have uncovered fragments of parchment, script still legible, buried in medieval waste pits. Why would scripture end up there? Argue, peasants, desperate for soft parchment, tore what they could find. But others suggest another possibility. Heretical texts, outlawed writings, prophecies, and secret manuscripts may have been recycled into waste as both humiliation and erasure. Wipe away the knowledge. Wipe away the evidence. Literally. If that sounds far-fetched, remember, this was an age of censorship. Knowledge was dangerous. The Knights Templar were burned at the stake in 1314, their archives seized, their books destroyed. Tales were wiped out in fire and war. The church erased entire traditions, and yet fragments survive. Sometimes in the unlikeliest of places, even in cesspits, even in the margins of household manuals. But here is where the conspiracy deepens. Why was this story hidden? Mainstream historians laugh it off as trivia. Peasants used moss, nobles used cloth. But look closer. Why do entire centuries of household manuals vanish? Why do pastoral letters from bishops mention only vague acts of uncleanliness? And why did priests instruct their flocks not to discuss such matters publicly? The Black Death swept Europe, killing millions. The link between filth and death was undeniable. Yet, official chronicles spoke only of divine punishment, never sanitation. One redacted letter from 1362, covered by a Vatican whistleblower known only as Frater L., instructed priests to discourage talk of bodily hygiene, lest the faithful seek false remedies rather than the mercy of God. In other words, stay silent about what truly spread disease. Think of what that means. To admit that filth, straw, communal rags, and seashells help spread plague would be to admit negligence. To admit the church and nobility let their people die in ignorance. Instead, the story was rewritten. Plague became divine wrath. Filth became normal. And the people remained silent, obedient, suffering, but never questioning. And yet, whispers remained. A French physician wrote of the evil that passes hand to hand in the cloth of the privy. This German poem mocked nobles who wipe in silk while peasants bleed in husk. In Florence, city records show laws against disposing parchment in waste pits. Why ban something, unless it was happening often enough to matter? So what if it is all true? What if toilet practices were more than trivia? What if they reveal how class divided survival? How censorship erased science? How entire plagues were worsened by suppression of hygiene? What if fragments of heretical prophecy were literally wiped away, hidden in the most private act of human life? Let's push deeper. Outside Europe, the story looks very different. In China, records from the 6th century describe the use of paper sheets for hygiene by nobles centuries before the West adopted toilet paper. In the Islamic world, water was central to ritual cleanliness. Hygiene tied directly to faith. A stark contrast to Christian Europe where silence about the body reigned. Imagine the difference. Entire civilizations shaped by what they used after the most basic act of all. One civilization washed, another censored. One preserved health, another preserved silence and disease. And so, when toilet paper finally emerged in the West centuries later, it was not invention, it was revolution. It represented not just comfort, but a break from silence, from filth, from centuries of suffering. It was civilization itself, rolled into a single object. But here is the revelation. What if the history of sanitation is not just about survival, but about control? What if entire plagues could have been prevented if the truth had been admitted? What if the class divide between nobles with linen and peasants with straw was not an accident, but a system of hierarchy enforced even in the most private act? What if the reason manuscripts of hygiene vanished was because they contradicted the narrative of divine punishment and threatened to expose that the plague was not God's wrath, but man's neglect? So, the next time you hold a roll of toilet paper, remember, this is not just convenience. It is the luxury of truth itself. It is the comfort our ancestors never had because their knowledge was erased and their suffering rewritten. History may not be what you were told. It never is, right? And I'll leave you with this chilling thought. If history was rewritten once, even in something as intimate as sanitation, could it happen again? Subscribe now, because truth, no matter how filthy or buried, always finds its voice.